some of you know me because you've had me audit your plant. I work for a small training and consulting company in Brisbane, Australia, but up until recently I was spending almost 50% of my months here in New Zealand working for one of the certification bodies here doing audits against SQF and BRC and various retailer standards. But I'm doing less of that now and a lot more consulting, particularly in the area of food fraud. I'm literally up to my eyeballs every waking hour doing raw material assessments for food fraud, which is great. I love that. Have to say it's probably better than auditing. And now I've probably just destroyed this. Okay. Dumb question. The big button, okay. Okay, so I know that you've heard about food fraud from a couple of different people so far, but something I wanted to stress is the difference between food fraud and food safety and food defence, because in different areas they're still being mixed up. So food fraud is an intentional act for economic gain. It's about making money. It's all about the money. Food safety incident is a unintentional act with unintentional harm. So we're hearing about the Campylobacter and the Salmonella in the chicken industry. Nobody woke up and said, let's kill people with Salmonella using chickens. Quite the opposite. They wanted to get rid of it. And a food defence incident is an intentional act with intentional harm. So if you're reading the American literature, they'll go on and on and on about terrorists wanting to come and kill you with the water supply. Yeah, possibly, maybe. But most of us in our everyday working lives here in New Zealand have to worry more about disgruntled employees or ex-employees and sabotage. Far bigger, more real issue. But that's not what we're talking about today. But I wanted to separate the differences. So we all know about HACCP, and we probably could sit here and chant it all off for the next 2 days. Food safety is controlled by hazard analysis critical control point to prevent unintentional adulteration or contamination. So it's all about the science, it's all about controlling foodborne illness, just everything that we've heard for the last half an hour from the last gentleman. But food defence is an entirely different thing. So it's looking for those disgruntled employees or any outside stakeholders who might want to harm your organisation. So ideologically motivated, it's not about the money at all. In fact, let's say in the chicken industry in Australia, we've recently had an act of what could be considered terrorism in a small plant in Melbourne, and that they easily found the person who did it. And she was quite open, like, okay, I'm going to go to jail. Yes, I broke into this plant 5 times, but I don't care. I'm there for the love of the chickens. And we may not agree with it, but that's that person's belief system. And yes, she'll go to jail, but she doesn't care, and no doubt she'll do it again and again and again. Food fraud, though, is intentional adulteration. It may not have a food safety implication, and it's all about somebody waking up in the morning and thinking, how can I make more money today? They don't necessarily intend to cause harm, and in many cases they don't, but it's about making money. So the definitions of food fraud are different in different countries. So this is important when you're exporting, to understand the definition within the country that you're selling your product in, because it may not be the same as here. So in the US, under FSMA, Food Safety Modernisation Act, they've got quite a precise one: intentional adulteration from acts intended to cause wide-scale harm to public health, including acts of terrorism, targeting the industry, or maybe hazards may be intentionally introduced for the purposes of economic gain. So they're covering both sabotage and economic gain in the same definition. The UK is really wordy and precise. Food fraud is considered to encompass the deliberate and intentional substitution, addition, tampering, misrepresentation of food ingredients, packaging, false or misleading statements about a product or for economic gain. So it's all about the money. Australia's is really quite wide and can catch anything in it. Gaining a financial advantage or causing a financial disadvantage through deception or dishonesty. So that covers product claims, substitution, dilution, anything. So it's not new. Food fraud's been around since the Roman times or earlier. So these are some books that are published out there that you can read. You can see the first one goes back to 1820, written by a German gentleman, about the treatise on adulteration of food and culinary poisons. The Jungle by Upton Sinclair is an American guy. Everybody in this room should read that if you haven't already. It was written as a novel about a Lithuanian or Latvian family moving to Chicago in the late 1880s, but it's really an expose of the Chicago meatpacking industries at that time and all of the food fraud and also social welfare issues, basically how they're screwing over the workers, animal welfare, absolutely, you name it. It's still in print today, and that, as a result of that book, US brought in their first food safety legislation, and that was not changed until 1996 with the Jack in the Box case. Fast Food Nation is an expose on the fast food chains in the US. Doesn't quite import exactly down here into Australia and New Zealand, but a lot of things to look at integrated supply chain management there. Poorly Made in China is a more recent one about the subcontracted manufacturing industry in China. It doesn't really concentrate on food, a lot more on like shampoos and soaps, but it helps you understand the subcontracted manufacturing industry in China. Sorting the Beef from the Bull was written by a UK chemist and a Guardian journalist, mostly about the horse meat scandal and a whole bunch of other food fraud incidences. So that's quite an interesting read too. And here's some much older ones from the UK. You can get these now if you can just download them off Google because they're out of print and so forth. And some of my clients use these because they've got some really basic methods of identifying food fraud and substitution and certain products that might be put into your products. It's really, shall we say, low-tech chemistry, and some of the same frauds are still being used today. So, each of the standards, the GFSI standards and the retailer and the customer standards out there have slightly different requirements. And this is also important to know to understand what your customers are expecting you to get out of your food fraud assessment. So BRC was the first GFSI standard to bring it in version 7. And you must have a system for identifying new risks to the authenticity of raw materials. Your approved supplier section should have a high concentration on this area, looking at your suppliers and what they're doing about product substitution and fraud. This is a real guts of it for BRC 3511. Documented risk assessment of each raw material must consider the risk of adulterated foods. So that's a really big one. One of my consulting clients has over 400 raw materials. Hence why they subcontracted me to do it, and hence why every waking hour is spent doing these assessments. And then 542, documented assessment of the vulnerability of the raw material supply chain. That can be quite hard. So one of my clients mostly buys their products within 100k radius. That's quite easy for them to check the supply chain in all aspects back to the farm. The other one is buying from literally all over the world. So, and some of their partners are very reluctant to supply information on traceability. Even BRC storage and distribution standards, so this is for warehouses, they have requirements for food fraud assessments under 10.1.1, supply risk assessment to include potential for adulteration or fraud. 10.2.1, documented vulnerability assessment, taking into account any historical evidence of substitution or adulteration. And if you identify risk, what are you going to do about it? This is for the warehouses. So SQF 8 that came in January this year, they have both TACCP and VASP. I've only put the food fraud aspects in here. under the manufacturing section that everybody will have to implement. Site's food forward vulnerability assessment to include that site's susceptibility to raw material or ingredient substitution that has an impact on food safety. Interestingly, the SQF, being an American-based system, has split up the food safety and quality potential impacts of food fraud because of the way the FSMA legislation's worded. So you need to have mitigation plans in place. You need to review it and test it annually. And then under quality code of SQF, which isn't mandatory, but I think every single SQF client in Australia and New Zealand's got the quality component, what used to be called level 3. You now need to have food defence plans to prevent actions that could adversely affect product quality, and food forward mitigation plans. Now, we were talking about 22,000 earlier today, the gentleman from Winkel. So I think it's coming in, section 241 requires vulnerability assessments that are documented and implemented, including to identify potential vulnerabilities, control measures, and prioritise them. And then it should, to identify the vulnerabilities, the organisation shall assess the susceptibility of its products to potential food fraud acts. So that's wide-ranging. Then you've got to have control measures, food fraud prevention plan, and meet any required legislation. So once again, knowing the legislation and the terminologies in the country that you're selling to. So lots of people here sell into either Countdown or Woolworths in Australia, because I've done lots of audits here for this standard. They too were one of the earliest to bring it in, and under their section 151, the supplier must assess the historical and developing threats to the supply chain, including risk of adulteration or substitution of raw materials. And then 152, the VASIP must be undertaken for all products supplied to Woolworths, and the risk considered on a global basis. They've also got a VASIP code of practice, so even if you're not supplying Woolies or Countdown, it's good read. So have a download of their code of practice and for methodology. BRC also has some guidance notes, so which are worth looking at as well. So the main key thing with Woolies for their outcome, they want a ranking of your identified hazards. Other sections just have identified hazards, action plans, mitigation plans, but Woolies wants you to rank those hazards, so put some numbers on them and review them annually. Now, cold supplier this is not cold supplier requirements, this is their full manufacturing standard. They've kind of combined TASIP and VASIP together, and they want you to undertake a documented threat assessment, but it does include fraudulent, adulterant or misrepresented foods or product claims. McDonald's is quite thorough in their standard. They want a documented VASIP assessment that covers the history of the fraud for that product, supplier status, performance history, control measures, availability of lower cost substitutions. I mean, that is absolutely enormous, because you have to work out how someone's going to do the fraud. Access to raw materials, historical evidence of substitution, and availability of test methods of adulterants. Once again, there's 23 known adulterants for cumin alone. That's what we know. What we don't know, how are you going to know about all the test methods? So Yum, so that's Kentucky Fried and various other chains. You shall have a documented food fraud program. You should conduct a food fraud or vulnerability assessments, control measures, potential risk for any deliberate attempt to cause contamination or damage, and make sure you have taken steps to mitigate the risk. And then there's more. So the program shall include conduct sampling, testing and supervision of samples of food supplies at all stages of the supply chain. I don't know how people are going to do that. That's fine if you're like my consulting clients who buy their products within a 100k radius, or if you have a vertically integrated supply chain, but otherwise that's almost impossible. And access to all stages of the supply chain must be monitored to mitigate risk. Unannounced inspections, guards, supervised management, employee reporting, and it shall be reviewed annually. So that second last dot point is almost identical in the Walmart standards as well, which I'm working with one of my clients to implement. So it's coming from the Americans, but it's also very hard to implement. And this is the actual US regulations, the FSMA Food Safety Modernisation Act. The words, you're expected to have a documented and implemented food defence plan, which includes a vulnerability assessment, and as a result you will have identify any significant vulnerabilities and actionable process steps. So once again, the wording's a bit different. They're not expecting you to have a ranking of your hazards. And if anyone's familiar with a number of the American VASIP consultants out there, they deliberately do not have a ranking of the hazards, because I understand under one particular act in the US, if you identify significant vulnerabilities, you have to let the regulatory people know, which then has huge ramifications. So, the top 10 fraudulent foods. The lists between the US and the EU change ever so slightly, and they change slightly year to year, but most of these, they might change from 3 to 4 or 5 to 3 or something similar, but these are the usual suspects. Olive oil is always number one. Fish or seafood, organic foods, milk, grains, honey and maple syrup, coffee and tea, spices, wine and fruit juice. So olive oil is just almost every month there's a new olive oil substitution or adulteration or product claims thing. And one of the reasons we're seeing a lot more of these is because the Italian government have set up a food crime unit within their police force, and they've linked very closely food fraud within their country to the mafia. So the mafia has breached out, and it's similar to organised crime across the world. Doing food fraud's much easier than running drugs, slaves, arms, and there's a lot less police attention in this area. As I said, the Italians have set up a new food crime unit, and so have the UK and Interpol. But outside that area, particularly certainly in Australia, if you talked about food crime to the police, they would just tell you to go away. They're just so not interested. So obviously with olive oil, they get substituted with every other type of vegetable oil. 8 out of 20 brands failed sensory tests. And the big thing is the claims of the origin. And that's always been the difficult. Is it really from Tuscany? Is it really from Sicily? Or wherever they're saying it's from? So this is one of the things that this new Italian food crime unit's got, is access to absolute cutting edge DNA technology, so they've been able to prove absolutely the sources of the olive oil. But one of the reasons why people wake up in the morning and decide to do food fraud is often to do with crop failure, which could directly be linked to climate change. So in 2014, I think it was, there was a very poor harvest in Spain, which is the biggest grower of olives in the world. And so the price went up at the bottlers up to 40%, so that price increase flowed on through the supply chain. And then when the trees were stressed from the hot weather, a bacteria came through and started killing the trees, which is actually going to have a longer term effect than one drought 1 year, because some of those trees would be many hundreds of years old and would have been producing, and so it'll take a long time to get those back up again growing. So here's another one. So this is the Italian, they've got a really long name, this Italian food police, Ministry of Agriculture's Inspectorate for the Protection, Quality and Repression of Fraud in Agriculture and Food. So basically Italian food crime unit. And so these guys have been out there taking samples left, right and centre. So this was in 2016. They found 200 tonnes of falsely labelled olive oil, and they arrested 50 different individuals throughout the entire supply chain. So they were basically, it was Italian olive oil, but they were making claims it was from a different province from where it was from. So, fish, something close to New Zealand's heart. You're a fabulous producer of wonderful seafood, and there's many, many, many substitutions. We can't go near covering the different ones. So one of the more hilarious ones that everyone likes is that calamari that's not calamari, but it's actually pig, part of the pig anatomy. Does everyone know what a bung is? Okay, basically it's a pig's asshole. And in Australia we have this product with calamari with a K, and that is not any part made of a fish at all. So you read the ingredients. If you buy that product with a K, don't buy it really. So another one is barramundi. So you go to a restaurant in Australia and they'll say Northern Territory wild caught barramundi. I'm so cynical. Unless I'm actually like sitting in Darwin, maybe at the harbour, I don't believe that. Because Nile perch, freshwater fish from Africa, is extremely close genetically to a barramundi. And once you grill it and put some sauce on it, there is no way your average restaurant goer can possibly tell the difference between Nile perch and barramundi. So there's been recently a lot of different DNA testing of seafood in different parts of the world. This was one from the US, but recently there was one done in Canada that had a lot of publicity. I met people who did that last year in Iceland, and there was also, we met some group of Spanish scientists, Basque scientists actually, who'd done one in that region. So this one was 1,200 samples across 674 retail outlets, and they found a third, or more than that, 33% of the samples were mislabelled. And so what's that? Mislabeling was found in 27 of the 46 fish types. So 60% of the fish types were mislabelled. And the two most commonly substituted were snapper and tuna. And only 7 of the 120 red snapper samples were actually correctly labelled. 44% of the grocery stores and sushi and restaurants sold mislabelled seafood. And the sushi restaurants were far more likely to mislabel their products than any other sector of the food service end. And in the huge cities of Chicago, New York, Austin, Texas, and Washington, D.C., every single sushi restaurant sold mislabeled tuna. I'm not buying tuna when I'm in the US again. So, and the scary one is the last one. 84% of the fish samples labelled white tuna, I don't know what white tuna is, was actually escalar. And the side effect of escalar, it's not food-borne illness, but it's a very, very oily fish, and you basically have explosive oily orange diarrhea. So definitely don't buy white tuna from a sushi restaurant in Chicago, New York or DC. Okay, a bit closer to home. Illegally caught New Zealand seafood sold on Facebook. So the MPI people have been out there scouring Facebook pages, and they've identified more than 250 cases where people were selling the fish they caught recreationally, and including I can't say it, the New Zealand, so they were selling that, and left, right and centre. Straight off the, Fiordland lobsters straight off the boat. So this was one in the US for blue crabs. This was a very large scale operation from 2012 to 2015. This person conspired to replace the Atlantic blue crab meat with crab meat from Indonesia, China, Thailand, Vietnam, South and Central America. And they mislabelled almost 400,000 tonnes of pounds of crab meat, obviously with retail value of many millions of dollars, and they called it the product of the United States. So they would remove the foreign crab meat from the original packaging containers, blend and combine that meat with the American crab meat from one processor with the meat from another processor, repackage it, relabeled it, saying product of the USA. So unfortunately, I would say that's relatively common in many parts of the world. Another one is organic food, and I know that New Zealand really prides itself on clean, green and organic all over the world. There's a lot of people out there undermining that brand name. So this is just one of many that I could have got, but this is staggering in its proportions. So it's grain. And it was, organic grain has grown in popularity, probably to feed like organic chickens and the so forth, organic cattle, particularly in the US. So a shipment started in the Ukraine, went to Turkey. There was 36 million pounds of soybeans. It started as ordinary soybeans grown in the Ukraine, and they were fumigated with pesticide as they were required to be. But by the time they got to California in December, they were miraculously organic. They had a USDA organic certificate. All the shipping records, receipts and invoices all matched, all said organic. So that increased their value while they were sitting on the ship by approximately $4 million US. And out of this load, already 21 million pounds of the soybeans have been sold within the US. And the reason is the large spike in demand, both in organic corn and soybeans. So between 2014 and 16, a huge amount of these two products have come in from Turkey. With the organic corn, it's risen from 15,000 pounds to almost 400,000 tons, 15,000 tons to almost 400,000 tons in 2 years. And it's coming from Turkey, an area not known for its broad acre agriculture. Under USDA rules, the importing company has to verify it's come from a USDA organic certified site. It must keep receipts and invoices, but doesn't have to do a trace check. So you can magic up a USDA certificate pretty easily. So these soybeans got into Stockton in December 2016, and how all this was tracked was by some journalists in the Washington Post who tracked it down to the original source, which was ADM in the Ukraine, who confirmed that they'd sold it, but they did not grow nor trade in organic grains. So it started at $360 a tonne, but when it was sold in the US, it was $600 a tonne because it now had its magic certificates. The company that was marketing them have stopped selling the products, but the company that imported them still says that they're absolutely wonderful and they're still organic. The real problem with this is not just that the American industry is being screwed over and their chickens and their cattle and so forth are not getting organic grains. It's also the small family farms in the Midwest who would normally be growing the organic grains because it's the only way that they can survive against the big multinationals, that the price of organic grains has now dropped something like 25%. So for a small family farm in the Midwest, that's the difference between survival or bankruptcy. And they're the ones being really screwed over. And no one is asking the question, where did all this organic grain suddenly get grown from? So I'm sure you've all heard about the melamine in the milk powders. So we'll have a quick go over that, but there's some other milk scams closer to home. So it started in 2007 with the cats and the dogs in the US, and so the American government picked up that the pets were dying. Why were they dying? Because the milk powder in the cat food and the dog food had melamine. And so then they cross-checked all the other industries. But nobody started testing the mainstream milk powder industry at that point, even though it wouldn't have been a hard stretch to do so. So then 2008, we had some more melamine in milk powders, and this time it was in China where the children were dying. So in the end, 6 babies died and 300,000 were ill. And this covered a huge, wide range of product groups, anything that got milk powder anywhere in the world. Then again, 2010, still kept happening. So at no time was the product that was contaminated rounded up. Nobody did any trace checks, nobody did any mass balances. So the authorities found 64 tonnes of raw material and 12 tonnes of finished product. And then they discovered 26 tonnes of tainted powder. And they only found it because the people who'd bought the warehouse full of this product knew it was contaminated, sent samples to the lab to find out exactly how contaminated it was and what they could do to dilute it back. And then the lab dobbed them in. So this is how it happens. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. They substitute it in because they're paid on protein, and by putting the melamine in, which is like a type of plastic, it ups the protein content and they get paid more. So ultimately, a few people were rounded up and shot. The Food Safety Minister was shot. The head of the Sanlu group who knew about it got life imprisonment. The middleman who produced 776 tonnes of the contaminated product, but he only sold 600. So there's 176 tonnes of finished product sitting around in a warehouse. He got shot. The head of the dairy farm who added the protein powder to the milk, he got shot. But it still hasn't made any difference. We still haven't rounded up the 176 tonnes. So it doesn't stop there. Paul Fonterra is still getting shot because at the end of 2016, the Chinese police rounded up 19 people for selling 300 tonnes of expired Fonterra milk powder on the electronic, not eBay, Alibaba, and there's a whole range of other ones in China as well. So they were repackaging them into small containers and then selling them below retail market value, and they alleged that 200 tonnes was sold. But the Chinese didn't invent milk fraud. If you go back and Google the swill milk scandal in the 1850s in New York, you'll find out all the things the Americans were doing to basically kill themselves in the Lower East Side of New York. So grains and nuts. Now you would think whole grains and nuts would be hard to fake, but there's you've just heard about the organic grains coming out of Turkey, Ukraine to Turkey. And this took me a long time to work out how this could be profitable with the walnuts. So they're using the shells of the walnuts from a real walnut factory. So the workers will take them home and then they will make little like fake walnuts with concrete, and they get that often from roadworks, and then they put the shells back together. And you think, how is this viable? Well, it's because the workers are doing it at home. They're using a waste product that they get for free, and then they just take it back and sell it back to the factory who sells it in bulk. So somebody, let's say in the West, is then buying X tonnes of shell-on walnuts, and particularly if it's being automatically deshelled, they're going to find foreign objects on their line. They're going to pick it up if they're sieving and so forth. But they're only ever going to have a few concrete walnuts within the batch of real walnuts. And so they might just put it down to foreign objects. And some of the nut processing plants I've been, the foreign object count is just phenomenal anyway. So they wouldn't necessarily notice a huge amount more with this. So that's how the margins are made. And the reason why people would be bothered to do this is the price increase. It's gone up from 3,500 yuan up to about 30,000 yuan over the last 10 years. So that's why it all comes down to the money. Now, we've probably all heard of rumours about the plastic rice. So it's made with, this was an interesting one because I went to do some searches to find an actual real case of plastic rice The only one I could find is this one in Nigeria in Christmas 2016. They didn't have the right documentation when it was imported, so it was put on hold. The guys, their Border Force guys, put it on hold, and then they started testing it. So how the plastic rice is made, once again, using a waste product from a real rice factory with the starch that's usually washed off, then combined with plastic resin to make the shape, and then shaped to make the grains. So once again, you wouldn't get a 25 kilo bag of plastic rice, you'd get maybe 1 kilo in your 25 kilo bag, so it would be blended up, so you wouldn't necessarily notice it. So once the guys at the dock put the rice on hold, it was then tested, but it was found to not be plastic rice, but to be contaminated. Hence why it didn't look right, smell right, feel right, and they didn't have their paperwork right. So it was destroyed because it was too contaminated to eat, but it was not actual plastic rice. So, and I've been using some of the food forward databases out there, and I haven't yet found official recorded case of plastic rice. But I've heard stories about it from various different Asian ports. So, honey, something close to New Zealand's heart. There's so many different combinations of substitutions you can do with honey, and they're all happening because it's such big business, particularly substitution with various types of sugars. And it's increasing because of deforestation, climate change, bee disease, and global warming. It's found a third of all fake honey was imported from Asia and had a wide range of contaminants over and above the sugar or the water, but also things like lead and antibiotics. The other thing is that people will use real honey, but then they'll make a different claim of where it's come from or what flower variety it's from. So maple syrup in Canada and places like Vermont is a mega industry, and the real stuff sells for about $50 a gallon, and it's all up, it's worth about $30 million in sales just for the state of Vermont. And this individual was found to be running, well, interesting, look what what he got charged on. It's nothing to do with food fraud or food safety or substitution, it's to do with mail fraud, wire fraud, and tax fraud. Probably what Al Capone went down for. And he sold hundreds of tons of cane sugar as passing it off as maple syrup. So in Canada, there was a grand maple syrup theft, and they did it for quite a while. Between August 2011 to July 2012, they stole 9,600 barrels, so that's about $30 million worth, from one warehouse in Quebec, and only 70% was recovered. The rest was already sold, probably into the US. And the industry in Canada is worth about $1 billion. So, and interestingly, I've done a maple syrup audit in Quebec, and even as the auditor, I was not allowed to go to the warehouse where the raw material was stored. I went through the processing plant. They actually have every warehouse under federal guard, and only one person from each plant can go and get the product out of the warehouse. So even as a third-party auditor, I was not allowed to go remotely near the warehouse. So, I'm going to count honey fraud. So this is a big one that we all read about all over the world from New Zealand. So this was when the product gets pulled off Fortnum Mason's shelves because the UK government-owned research agency did some tests on the UK retailers' products, and only one of the 7 samples tested was found to have the right levels of the key ingredient. And that came a year after honey labels on the UK shelves there was more honey on the UK retailer shelves than was possibly produced in New Zealand, not to mention all the other stuff sold all over the world. And that is, a small jar can cost up to £34. And compared with £1.78 for normal honey. That's wow, it's real economic incentive there to start doing fake honey. So the first thing is dishonest labelling, where they just get real honey and put a different made in New Zealand label on it. Or they put in things like sugar syrup of all different types. Tea and coffee. Pretty easy to see why that would be frauded. There's massive profit margins in this. So some of the things, when I was doing a bit of research on this topic, the bubble tea, apparently there's lots of fake bubbles made out of things like old tyres and old shoe soles. I didn't like them before, definitely not going to have any now. So here's one tea situation. Obviously I'm not a tea connoisseur at all, so this is obviously some high value tea from a particular region in China, and 5 people were arrested and they'd made nearly 23,000 cakes of tea, and they were being sold up to 10 RMBs for 500 grams, so that's around only $1 a cake. But the real this particular type of tea cakes can be sold up to $40 each. So that's a real buyer beware. If somebody was offering you these tea cakes for around $1 a cake when the real ones sell for $40, big flag, it's not real. So coffee has a huge history of being faked in many, many ways. So it can be flavoured, it can be selling defective coffee and then dark roasting and grinding it, stolen coffee, mislabeling low-grade coffee as high-grade coffee, mislabeling the coffee origin, I'd say that one's massive, and selling old roasted coffee or past crop coffee. And when I was working in the US, I met an auditor who did environmental audits in South and Central America on the coffee plantations. In one of them in Colombia, he was looking at doing assessments on the coffee beans, and he found human teeth in with the beans, and he decided then that the people would pass the audit with flying colours, and he would fly out as fast as he could and then ring his certification body and not do coffee anymore. So there's once again talking about some of the simple methods that you can detect fraud, and this is one with if people have put clay powder in with coffee powder, and that the adulterated stuff should sink to the bottom where the pure stuff should float to the top. So some of those old books from the 1800s out of the UK, this is the type of thing that they've got in there. Tests to find chalk, brick dust, and so forth. It doesn't necessarily require a forensic DNA lab. Now, spices. This is the industry that's been at food fraud for many, many, well, it has to be said, thousands of years. And they're very good at it. So it's all about the prices, and often to do with crop failures. Lots of them don't have a food safety implication, but the really spectacular ones that did was the cumin in 2014 to 16, which was full of almonds and peanuts, and people did die. And then the oregano that you may have heard of in Australia. So with the oregano, the magazine Choice did some samples, and only, I think it was 7 out of 12 were actually oregano, and some of them were less than 10% oregano. What, oregano? Mostly olive leaves, which makes sense because they grow in the same areas. So they all the fake ones had olive leaves, but some of them, 2 of them had sumac leaves, which is another plant that grows in that area. So somewhere along the supply chain for oregano, somebody woke up and decided to put in particularly olive leaves. So after that, it was widely reported the Choice findings. So then the sister magazine in the UK called Which did a similar test, and 19 of the 78 samples they tested failed. They too all contained olive leaves, and some also contained lemon myrtle, which I thought was a bit unusual because that would have a strong taste. Then some people in Denmark did a similar thing. 4 out of 10 there failed, and they also contained olive leaves and lemon myrtle leaves. So what we're seeing here is very consistently the olive leaves were in there, and so that would probably done pretty close to the source, and then further down the line there's other leaves are being added at different supply chains. So I'm not sure whether New Zealand had any recalls of cumin in 2014 to 16. In Australia we didn't, which is very surprising because I'm absolutely sure we would have had some contaminated product. So there were 67 different cumin-related recalls in this time, 15 in the UK, 2 in the EU, and 47 in the US, and 3 in Canada. And they were found to have up to 100,000 parts per million peanuts. So you think, why would it be economically viable to just put in peanuts? They weren't grinding up the nuts, they were grinding up the shells or the husks. So similarly, almonds were found in there, and it was the husks were being ground up. So once again, a waste product being used by a different industry. But it still had the allergen in it. And the ones in Canada ended up not being nuts at all, but being ground up cherry seeds. The reason it happened was, once again, a crop failure in India. So they had 50% or 40 to 50% less yield, so the price skyrocketed. And cumin is the most commonly used spice in the EU. So there's a huge demand for it. So if they'd only added 1% of shells, which we know they added a lot more, they would be making $400 of profit on sale of 10 tonnes. So they're making a lot more profit than that. So here's a more recent one where an individual in Hyderabad was adulterating 4 different types of spices, selling them into the wholesalers who were then repackaging them. He was selling them at 75% of the going market rate. All the people in the supply chain then added 5 or 10% along, so they were all making money. I'm not sure what he was substituting them with, and he was paying people off through the chain. Now, and he's doing it 20,000 kilos, or nearly 21,000 into Hyderabad, and then another 15,000 kilos into Delhi every month. That's a lot of spices. Hyderabad is the centre of the spice industry in India, so there's no way that Australia and New Zealand didn't end up with some of this product. And some of the recent raw material assessments I've been doing, I've found cumin recalls in cinnamon and a whole wide range of other products as well. It wasn't just the cumin. Okay, I've been told to wind up the time. There's a huge amount of fraud in the wine industry. Once again, the Italian police are really onto this. But it's not just the Italians, it's also the New Zealanders. So this one was it last year or the year before? So this company was using various different types of grape varieties, processing them into wine, calling them other grape varieties. And it covered Marlborough, Waiparapa, Sauv Blanc, Pinot Noir, and it was a whistleblower who dobbed them in, because they were obviously doing it for quite a few years. So Interpol's really getting onto it, and they're working with as I said, the British Food Crime Unit and the Italians, really cracking down on a wide range of foods, but particularly this is fake Tuscan wine. Fruit juices, a really obvious one, particularly the more exotic juices, more valuable juices like pomegranate. So this is from a 2014, congressional hearing of a list of some of the different types of fruit juice frauds out there and how widespread it is. And so this is an example one where they brought in products from Brazil, diluted it with pulp wash and then relabeled it. And so, then they had to add other ingredients to cover the taste of the product that they'd added in. And so this one was a Coca-Cola company, and they actually, with their pomegranate and blueberry juice, and they ended up they didn't get charged with this, Well, they were charged, but they weren't prosecuted. They got away with it through some loophole. So, as different people have told you, and you can see from the requirements of the GFSI and retailer standards, is once you've done your risk assessments, identified your risk, you've then got to do something about it. And that's often the hardest part. And I don't have time so to go through all those. You can ask me, I'll be here for the rest of the day. So, as I said, this one was highlighting the very different culture in the subcontracted manufacturing industry in China. I'm not sure whether many New Zealand companies do that, but certainly in the US and Australia, a lot of companies are. So here's some closer to home, some New Zealand fake organic eggs. And so this one was where millions of caged eggs were being sold as free range. And I was involved in doing some of the audits, unannounced retailer audits on the egg packing sheds, and interestingly, one of them refused me entry when I was explained what I did. I said, "Okay, sign here. I'm going. I'll leave now." So it goes on. I'm sure you're pretty familiar with this one. Had a lot of publicity. And then there's also a lot of people in New Zealand thinking up new technology, new testing methods, new labelling methods to help combat this. I'd actually have to say New Zealand is far more proactive in this area than Australia is, and far more aware, particularly on nanotechnology within labelling for the fruit industry, testing in various labs. So this is one where people can, a Dunedin company can fingerprint free-range eggs to deter at individual farm levels with fingerprints on the eggs. I'm not sure how it all works. It's chemical fingerprinting. And so it's not just about the paperwork and the audits and the trace checks. So, yep. And I do work, as I said, in Auckland. So recently we did run TASIPs and VASIP courses. If we've got the demand, we'll come back and do some more. And we do BRC, so we'll be back in October to do BRC version 8 training courses for everybody. Any questions? Yep, that's fine. I'll be here all day.